Hey everyone, and welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a question that I know has been on everyone's minds, and it's really just about the whole relationship between truth and politics.
hmm
When we get down to it, do politicians, are they legally obligated to be honest?
Yeah,
You've given us a really interesting set of sources here, legal documents, political analyses, even some stuff from, other countries to look at.
right.
So we're excited to dig into it.
Yeah, I think this is a question that's so timely,
Yeah.
especially right now. With information is misinformation spreading like wildfire. It's something that all democracies are grappling with.
Okay, so let's dive right into it. In the notes that you sent me, you highlighted Germany,
hmm
and I think that's a fascinating place to start. They've got this concept called Wahrheitspflicht,
Right.
which honestly sounds kind of intense.
It does, doesn't it?
What's that all about?
Yeah. It essentially means duty to truthfulness.
Yeah.
But it's not like there's like a giant, law in Germany that says all politicians must tell the truth at all times.
Right.
It's way more nuanced. It's sort of woven into the fabric of their legal and political systems.
Interesting. So less like a giant gavel slamming down and
Sure.
more like a deeply ingrained expectation.
Exactly.
Right.
But they do have specific legal mechanisms that come into play. For example, their criminal code, the Strafgesetzbuch,
Okay.
has provisions against perjury, defamation, these kinds of things.
Right.
So if a politician lies under oath or they spread lies that damage someone's reputation, they can face some serious legal repercussions.
That makes sense. So there are teeth behind this duty to truthfulness. It's not just some, lofty ideal.
No, it's about accountability.
Yeah.
Then we have the Abgeordnetengesetz, which outlines the duties of members of parliament. Now, this one doesn't explicitly forbid lying, but it stresses the importance of, fulfilling your duties conscientiously, which is kind of interpreted to include being truthful.
Okay, so more about setting a tone, a kind of top-down integrity that shapes the culture of politics, essentially.
Precisely. It's really about, while it's hard to police every single statement, you want to create a system where honesty is just expected and valued.
Okay, that's a really fascinating glimpse into how Germany approaches this whole thing, but as your research shows, it's not the same everywhere.
Not at all.
So what about the United States, the land of free speech and, sometimes outlandish claims from politicians?
Yeah, the U.S. it presents a really stark contrast.
Okay.
The First Amendment offers incredibly strong protection for free speech, and that extends to what they call political speech, even if it veers away from, the truth.
So that's why, I feel like we've seen situations where politicians can make claims that are pretty clearly false, especially during, the heat of a campaign.
Oh, absolutely.
And they don't really face
Right.
legal repercussions for it.
No. And the 2016 presidential election was a really good example of this.
Yeah.
With Donald Trump as a candidate, there was just this deluge of misinformation. Fact-checking organizations were working overtime to debunk these claims, but they often persisted and were even amplified, through social media.
Right.
It really started to raise serious questions about, where do we draw the line?
Yeah.
Where does free speech bump up against truth?
Right. Do you remember that claim that he made about seeing thousands of people in New Jersey celebrating after the 9/11 attacks?
I do. That was one that was widely debunked, by news organizations and fact-checkers, but it just kept circulating.
Right. And that's what was so crazy about it. It really highlights, I think, the challenges that voters face,
Yeah.
just trying to figure out what's true.
Yeah, it's overwhelming, isn't it?
Totally.
Now, contrast that with the UK. The UK has historically taken a slightly different path. They have much stricter defamation laws, which means politicians can actually be held liable for knowingly spreading false information that, harms someone's reputation.
So you can't just sling mud without consequence.
No. You risk a lawsuit. This system is really designed to, encourage responsible discourse and protect people from lies that are, meant to hurt them.
Gotcha.
But of course, there are complexities there as well. They have this concept called parliamentary privilege,
Right.
which gives absolute immunity for anything said within the walls of Parliament.
Wait, so anything goes in Parliament?
Essentially, yes.
That seems like a recipe for chaos.
It does, doesn't it? But the thinking behind it is that parliamentarians need to be able to speak freely, to represent their constituents, to challenge the government, without fear of legal action. But it does raise some interesting questions about balancing that free speech with accountability, especially when those statements reach the public, get picked up by the media, and potentially influence public opinion.
It is an interesting contrast, yeah. You also pointed out the Brexit referendum in the notes.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good example of how these issues can play out.
Absolutely. The Brexit referendum was just a prime example of this playing out in real time. Both sides of the debate were accused of bending the truth, making claims about the economic impact, about immigration, how much money the UK was sending to the EU.
Right.
That later turned out to be, either misleading or straight up false. There were even legal challenges brought against certain campaigns for spreading this misleading information.
Wow. So even with the stricter defamation laws, it's still a struggle to get complete honesty, especially when it's something as emotionally charged as, the whole Brexit situation was.
Absolutely. I mean, these are complex issues.
Right.
With strong emotions.
Yeah.
And it seems like every country is wrestling with this in its own way.
What about France?
Yeah.
You mentioned that they have a pretty unique approach.
They do. France has taken a more, I would say, proactive legislative approach.
Yeah.
They actually have specific laws against spreading false information, like literally disseminating fake news.
Okay.
You could be penalized for that. And they have a really interesting body called the Conseil Supérieur de l'Audiovisuel, or CSA, which is an independent body that regulates broadcast media.
Right.
And they can actually issue sanctions for violations.
Wow. So it sounds like they're taking a much more hands-on approach to combating misinformation. It's clear that, the legal framework is a huge part of this.
Right.
But what about all the folks that are outside of that system?
Yeah.
Like journalists or fact-checking organizations or even just everyday citizens that are calling out, BS.
Absolutely. They play a crucial role.
Yeah.
I mean, laws set the groundwork, but the media and civil society are so important in holding politicians accountable and ensuring that the public has access to accurate information.
Right.
We've seen the rise of these independent fact-checking organizations, and they've become increasingly prominent.
Yeah.
Really scrutinizing those claims and providing evidence-based analyses.
It's like they're the referees of the political arena, like blowing the whistle on misleading statements.
I love that analogy. I love that.
Yeah.
And then we're seeing citizen initiatives becoming more influential as well, with people coming together to, fact check or raise awareness about misinformation. And of course, the media has this huge responsibility to not just report passively, but to provide context, analysis, and to actually fact check what's being said.
Yeah.
It's all about empowering citizens to make informed decisions.
So it's like a multifaceted effort, right?
Yeah.
You've got laws setting up some boundaries, fact checkers, and just, regular people out there scrutinizing information. And then the media's helping, trying to keep the public informed.
That's the ideal, right?
Yeah.
A system of checks and balances to safeguard truth and integrity. But we can't ignore the elephant in the room, or maybe I should say the algorithm in our pocket.
You mean social media? Yeah. It feels like it's totally changed the game when it comes to truth and politics.
It really has. It's a double-edged sword, right?
Right.
Social media provides this incredible access to information. It allows people to actually engage with politicians and with each other directly about these issues.
Yeah.
But it also allows for the rapid spread of misinformation. It creates these echo chambers where falsehoods can just fester.
Yeah.
It's hard to even tell what's real and what's not anymore.
It's a constant, fire hose of information. Some of it's true, some of it's not, and it feels almost impossible to keep up.
Right.
So are there solutions for this? Like, what are we going to do?
There's a lot of debate about that, and it's
Yeah.
something that, like I said before, all democracies are dealing with. Some people argue that social media platforms need to be held accountable. Like, they should be responsible for combating the spread of this fake news on their sites,
Okay.
maybe through stricter moderation or their own fact-checking initiatives.
Right. But then other people worry about censorship.
Of course.
And do we really want these companies to be the ones deciding what's true and what's not?
Exactly. It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
It raises those questions about free speech, the role of these private companies in our public discourse, and, the very nature of truth itself. This is a debate we need to be having, and one that we'll keep exploring as we move forward in this deep dive.
It's clear that social media has just added this whole new layer of complexity to the whole thing. But, before we go totally down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
I want to shift gears a little bit because in our prep notes, you mentioned some really specific things that are being done to kind of encourage honesty and transparency. Things like, lobby registers or financial disclosure requirements.
Right.
What are those all about?
Those initiatives are really all about pulling back the curtain. shining a light on, what's often a pretty murky world and holding those in power accountable, both for their actions and their finances. So, for example, lobby registers make it clear who's trying to influence politicians on what issues.
Yeah.
And that transparency helps us understand, what forces are at play and if there are any potential conflicts of interest.
So it's about lifting the veil of secrecy, right?
Yeah.
Letting the sunlight disinfect anything shady that might be going on?
Exactly. Transparency is a powerful tool.
Yeah.
Then you've got financial disclosure requirements. They mandate that politicians reveal their income sources, their assets, which prevents them from, profiting from their positions or being unduly influenced by outside interests.
It all comes back to accountability.
It does.
Right. Making sure that those who represent us are actually, acting in our best interests and not just serving their own agendas.
Precisely. It's about building trust and making sure that the system serves the people it's supposed to represent.
So you've got all these measures, right?
Yeah.
Combined with the role of the media and engaged citizens. And it creates this kind of framework, right?
It does.
To hold power to account. But it makes me wonder, with all of this focus on external mechanisms, what about just the responsibility of each individual citizen?
You're hitting on a really, really crucial point. It's not just about external forces. The best defense against all of this, against the misinformation, against the dishonesty, is an informed and engaged citizenry. And that brings us to the essential role of education and media literacy.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, we need to equip people with the tools and skills to critically evaluate the information that they're being bombarded with constantly.
Okay.
So separate fact from fiction. Understand how the media operates, how it's produced. Recognize the tactics that are used to manipulate our opinions and to spread these falsehoods.
So it's not just about, teaching kids how to spot a fake news article online. It's about a much deeper understanding of how information works.
Exactly. It's about understanding bias, conscious and unconscious, and being able to evaluate sources critically.
Okay. Wow. This deep dive is already incredibly eye-opening, but honestly, it's a little overwhelming too.
That's a lot, isn't it?
It is. So before we move on to part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll look at some real-world examples of all of this colliding.
Yeah.
Let's quickly recap what we've talked about so far.
Okay.
We started in Germany,
Right.
where this Wahrheitspflicht, this duty to truthfulness is baked into their political system. It's this combination of legal frameworks and cultural expectations.
Right.
And then we hopped over to the U.S.,
Yeah.
where free speech, while so important, can sometimes lead to an environment where misinformation thrives.
Absolutely.
Which is the downside.
Right.
We also looked at the UK.
Yeah.
They're trying to balance free speech with accountability with these stricter defamation laws. And then, of course, there's that unique idea of parliamentary privilege. And we even peeked over at France, where they've gotten really proactive, creating specific laws to combat the spread of false information.
Yeah. I think France is a really interesting example to watch.
Totally. We also talked about how the media, fact-checking organizations, and engaged citizens play this really crucial role.
Absolutely.
Right, in scrutinizing information and, holding politicians accountable. And then, of course, we had to talk about the elephant, or rather, the algorithm in the room.
Right.
Social media.
It's inescapable these days.
It's totally reshaped everything, right?
Yeah.
It's created both opportunities and challenges when it comes to truth and politics.
Yeah.
And finally, we touched on these transparency measures, things like lobby registers, financial disclosure requirements.
Absolutely crucial.
And the vital role of education and media literacy.
Yes.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
But I think it really points to this key takeaway.
Yeah.
Truth in politics isn't just this on-off switch.
Right.
It's this super complex ecosystem involving laws, cultural norms, technological forces, and just plain individual responsibility.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've laid this foundation. We've explored the global landscape of truth and lies in politics. Now I think it's time to get into some real-world examples. Let's look at how all of this plays out in the, messy arena of actual political campaigns and decisions.
I think that's a great idea because real-world examples are just so key to understanding all these complexities.
Okay.
Remember that conversation we had about the U.S. and its really expansive free speech protections?
Yeah.
Well, I think the 2016 U.S. presidential election offers a really compelling case study.
Oh, absolutely. You were mentioning how the fact checkers had a field day during that election.
They did.
Particularly with some of the claims that were coming from, then candidate Trump.
Right.
So what were some of the most, the most glaring ones that come to mind?
Well, one that immediately springs to mind is the claim about the size of the crowd at his inauguration.
Oh, right.
He just kept saying it was the largest inauguration crowd ever. But, photographic evidence, expert analysis, all showed that it just wasn't true.
Yeah, and I feel like that just became this whole thing.
It did.
It wasn't just like a minor detail,
Right.
It seemed to point to this broader pattern of, disregard for factual accuracy.
Exactly. I mean, it wasn't just about the size of the crowd. It was about a willingness to make a claim that was just demonstrably false.
Mm-hmm.
And this pattern really just kind of continued, throughout his presidency with all sorts of statements about, crime statistics or the origins of COVID-19.
Right. It just highlights, I think, the challenges that journalists face, that fact checkers face, that, everyday citizens face.
Right.
Just trying to figure out, okay, what's true?
What is real?
Right.
Yeah. And it's a really troubling trend. And it's not just confined to the U.S., You were interested in the UK, the Brexit referendum, which offers another fascinating case study.
Absolutely. I mean, that was such a pivotal moment in British politics, and the campaigns leading up to that vote were so heated.
Oh, yeah.
And you mentioned there were even legal challenges
Right.
related to some of the claims being made. So what happened there?
Well, probably the most contentious claim from that whole campaign was the £350 million a week figure.
Right.
The Leave campaign, they plastered it on buses, on advertisements.
Oh, yeah, the big red bus. I remember that.
Exactly.
It was all over the news.
They said this is how much the UK sends to the EU every week that could, be redirected to the National Health Service, if they left.
Right. But wasn't there a lot of pushback on that number?
Yeah, there was. Yeah. Fact-checking organizations, they were all over that, pointing out that the figure was really misleading. It didn't take into account, the rebate that the UK got from the EU, and it didn't even consider the economic benefits of membership.
Right. So it was this classic case of, cherry-picking data to make a point, even if it wasn't totally accurate.
Precisely. And it shows how even with stricter defamation laws, like in the UK, it's still difficult to stop misinformation from influencing people, especially during a really emotionally charged event like that.
Right. And that's what's so interesting about these examples. It's not always outright lies, right? It's often this more subtle spin or, something's left out, or maybe even just using really emotionally charged language to try and manipulate how people see things.
Yeah, it's that gray area that makes it so challenging. And that's where critical thinking and media literacy becomes so important.
Right.
Citizens need to be able to look at this stuff or look at these claims and figure out what's real and what's not to recognize those subtle tactics. And, of course, we can't forget about social media.
Oh, yeah. It's the big one.
Which, as we've discussed, has just completely reshaped the information landscape. So, how has social media amplified all of these challenges?
Well, just think about how we even consume information on social media, right? It's these little bits and pieces, often out of context, with these attention-grabbing images or headlines that are designed to, make you feel something.
Right, get you riled up.
And then there's these algorithms that are curating our feeds, prioritizing engagement over accuracy. And it's creating these echo chambers where we're really only exposed to information that confirms our existing biases.
Yeah, it's like we're all living in these, personalized bubbles.
Right.
And it's really hard to step outside of that.
Yeah, it's almost like our own beliefs are just constantly being reflected back to us.
Exactly. And this makes it so easy for misinformation to take root and spread.
Yeah.
False claims can go viral so quickly, shared by people who might not even realize they're sharing something that's not true.
Yeah, it's like a game of telephone, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And what's worse, these platforms, they want to keep us scrolling, right?
Right.
They want us engaged. And the more time we spend there, the more data they get, and the more effectively they can, target us.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is.
We're drawn in, we want to connect, we want information, and we end up trapped in these echo chambers, where critical thinking just goes out the window.
Right.
And that has such a huge impact, I think, on democracy as a whole.
Oh, yeah?
When citizens don't know how to or can't figure out what's real, they become much easier to manipulate.
Absolutely. And the whole foundation of informed decision-making just kind of crumbles.
It feels like we're losing our ability to even just have these, like, rational conversations about the issues that matter most.
Yeah.
And this is all a little bit bleak.
It is.
Are there any glimmers of hope? Like, is there anything that gives you some optimism?
I mean, there are. The challenges are real, but I don't think they're insurmountable.
Okay, good.
There's actually a lot of energy and innovation right now focused on finding answers, and we're seeing all kinds of initiatives popping up from tech companies, from policymakers, from journalists, educators, citizens. People are trying to figure this out.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So we've spent a lot of time talking about this complex relationship between truth and politics. We've looked at legal frameworks, we've talked about the wild west of social media, we've seen how easily misinformation spreads, the challenges it poses to democracies. But now I kind of want to shift gears and talk about solutions.
Oh.
You're not just interested in understanding the problem. Right. You want to know what can be done about it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's get into it. What can we actually do to safeguard truth in our political systems?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
But the good news is that there's a lot of people out there working on this, a lot of really smart people.
Okay, good.
There's a ton of energy and innovation going on, and we're seeing all kinds of initiatives from tech companies, policymakers, journalists, educators, everyday citizens. People are getting creative.
That's encouraging. So let's start with, the tech world.
Okay.
Because, they're often seen as both the problem and the potential solution.
Right. They're right at the heart of it.
So what are some of the most promising tech-driven approaches to fighting this misinformation?
Well, one area where we're seeing some real progress is the development of AI-powered fact-checking tools.
Oh, interesting.
These tools can actually scan text, images, even videos, cross-referencing them with these massive databases of, reliable sources to flag anything that seems potentially false or misleading.
So it's almost like a truth-bot army patrolling the internet.
Kind of, yeah. Like these digital detectives sniffing out fake news in real time.
Okay, I like it.
Of course, they're not perfect.
Right.
They could be tricked and they can struggle with nuance, especially when you get into context and satire and things like that.
Yeah.
But they are getting better all the time.
Okay.
And I think they offer a really powerful weapon in this fight.
That's pretty amazing, honestly. What else is happening on the tech front? Is there anything else?
Yeah, another important area is something called algorithm transparency.
Yeah.
Right now, the algorithms that are shaping our social media feeds, they're basically black boxes, right? We don't really know how they work, how they choose what we see, or how they might be boosting certain types of content, including, misinformation.
Which is unsettling. It makes you feel like you're being manipulated, but you don't even know how.
Exactly. And it can be really frustrating. So there's a lot of people out there saying, hey, we need to make these algorithms more transparent. Users should have more control over what they see, and they should be able to understand how these platforms are shaping their experience.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But what about, the people behind all of this? What about the people who are intentionally spreading misinformation?
Yeah.
The ones who are actually profiting from, all the chaos and distrust. Can technology really address that?
Well, that's where I think policy and regulation really come in. There are a lot of conversations happening right now about holding individuals and organizations accountable for knowingly spreading harmful falsehoods. For example, some people are calling for tougher rules on online political advertising.
Mm-hmm.
More transparency about who's paying for those ads and what their agenda is.
So bringing some of the rules that, apply to traditional media into this whole digital space.
Exactly. It's about leveling the playing field. And another big focus is strengthening the laws around disinformation campaigns, especially the ones run by, foreign actors.
Right.
This might involve increasing the penalties for spreading false information that is intentionally designed to mess with elections or undermine public trust in institutions.
I mean, those all sound like, positive steps.
Yeah.
But it does raise concerns about, censorship and free speech.
Of course. And that's always the tension.
Yeah.
How do we protect freedom of expression while also protecting people from dangerous lies?
Right.
There's no easy answer. It's a conversation that requires a lot of nuance, and it's something we need to keep talking about as a society. It needs to involve lawmakers, tech experts, ethicists, citizens, everyone, really.
So it sounds like, you need a multi-pronged approach, right?
Yeah,
You need the technological solutions and you need the legal frameworks.
absolutely.
But it seems like we're still missing a piece of the puzzle.
You're right, we are. I mean, we can have all the best tech in the world and the strictest laws, but if people don't know how to spot misinformation, if they don't know how to think critically, it's not going to solve the problem.
So we need to go back to education.
Yes, absolutely. Education and media literacy.
Okay.
We have to give people the tools to evaluate information, to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate them, to think for themselves.
So it's not just about knowing what's true or false.
No, it's way bigger than that.
Mm.
It's about understanding how information works, how it's created, how it spreads, and how it can be used.
So how do we make this media literacy thing a reality?
It's a big challenge, but we need to integrate it into everything, School curriculums at all levels, starting in elementary school and all the way through college. But it can't just be in schools. It also needs to be in libraries, community centers, families even.
Wow, so it's about creating this culture of critical thinking.
Exactly. Where
Yeah.
people just naturally question what they see and hear, They don't just accept things blindly.
And I guess that's where, journalists come in too, right?
Absolutely.
Those trusted media outlets.
In a world that's flooded with misinformation, good journalism is more important than ever.
Right, because it's about providing that balance.
Yes.
Evidence-based reporting, in-depth analysis, fact-checking. It's about helping people make sense of really complex issues and
Yeah.
being a source that they can actually rely on.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, it's about reminding everyone why truth matters. It matters in our personal lives, it matters for our communities, and it really matters for our politics.
This deep dive has been so informative and, to be honest, kind of inspiring.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
What are the key takeaways that you want, our listeners to walk away with?
Well, I really hope people come away from this feeling empowered, not overwhelmed.
Okay.
The challenges are there, but we can do something about it. We all have a responsibility to stand up for truth, whether it's by getting better at thinking critically ourselves, by supporting great journalism, by fighting for policies that make things more transparent and hold people accountable.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We
Mhm.
started with a big question. Do politicians have to tell the truth? And it turns out there's not a simple answer.
No, there isn't.
It's really complicated, right? It's got all these layers, legal, cultural,
A
technological.
tangled web.
We looked at how different countries deal with it, how social media has changed everything, and how important education and media literacy are. But most importantly, we've talked about what we can do. Solutions, from these really cool AI fact checkers to policy changes, all the way to everyday people working to make things better. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play here.
We do. We absolutely do.
So to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of truth and politics. Stay curious, stay critical, and don't be afraid to ask questions.